Awesome. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is that you do, as opposed to undergrad, where a lot of us were paying a lot of money to attend, and it was all kind of out of pocket. When you do go to grad school, you do often get really great funding packages, and you get paid to learn, and you get paid to go to school, and you get to really delve into things that you find exciting or interesting. You get to kind of choose your trajectories, which is something that you don't often get as much control over during your undergraduate studies. You get to take higher level and engaging courses. You often will get funding from your supervisor or from your grants to travel and attend conferences. You get to participate in TA-ships, getting to work with students, which I always found extremely rewarding. Get to work in a lab with other people who are interested in the same things as you, and really form a close-knit cohort, which becomes a really kind of fundamental aspect of being a grad student. And finally, this does tend to open a lot of doors for people. People from my cohort, from my graduate training, all ended up finding really nice jobs. They all kind of landed on their feet. So a graduate diploma or a degree can open a lot of doors for you, either if you're wanting to stay within academia and eventually teach or do research, but also outside. A lot of our degrees are very respected and some are required for certain jobs and certain occupations. So there are a lot of great reasons why to do grad school, but how do you get there? And while it isn't for everyone, there are lots of approaches to get there. Often you'll hear kind of the standard, okay, yeah, I did really well in high school, then I did really well in undergrad, and then I went to grad school, and it was kind of this really kind of um, standard approach. But that's not how a lot of people get there. And as you talk to a lot of the faculty within our department and others, you'll hear a lot of really interesting stories about the trajectories they took. And for instance, I kind of just barely completed high school and ended up being like, all right, I'm done with school. I don't know what I want to do. I ended up kind of going with my partner and hitchhiking slash taking buses across BC, doing the Willing Workers on Organic Farms program for quite a long time. And we kind of found that was really an interesting thing. We ended up in British Columbia and actually falling in love with the area out here. But then when we went back to Ontario, which is where I was from, I was like, well, what do I like to do? And I really liked to cook. And so I ended up after high school getting a degree in culinary management from George Brown College, which is very different from where I ended up today. But eventually, I realized that those were great skills, and but it was the hours, the stress, working in a kitchen is real. It's a really, really hard job, and it was something that I thought, well, maybe wanted to pursue some higher education. So I ended up going to and applying to a small liberal arts college in Quebec called Bishop's University. It's in Sherbrooke, Quebec, which at that point was called Lennoxville. And it was this little English bubble in Quebec. At the time, the school had less than 2,000 students in the entire campus, had no graduate degrees. It was primarily undergraduate. And I really got to know the psychology department faculty while I was there. And so they were extremely passionate, very supportive people. And they really helped kind of hone everyone's skills in terms of what kind of things would you do with a psychology degree, and my focus was on experimental psychology, so we got to learn about coding different experiments, and I did some mental rotation tasks and things like that for my research. And at the time, it was a really interesting experience because not only were we kind of learning about what it means to be within a psychology department, but just getting to interact with the faculty and getting to see kind of what they did and what they got excited about. And during that time, one of the quintessential kind of experiences that I had was join a course called the Honors Seminar class. So during the degree, I was kind of encouraged to work towards an honors diploma. And this class in particular, we have a similar one in our department, was really foundational in terms of giving students practical skills, how to reach out to supervisors, how to think about your next steps in terms of grad school and think about your research projects. And it gave a lot of really concrete skills. And we got to, as kind of part of that course, talk to supervisors from different grad schools and try to introduce ourselves and kind of get our feet in the door. And it turns out that worked. I ended up making some really great contacts at York University in Toronto, where I did my MA degree in the history of psychology. At the time, I was really interested in the history of intelligence testing and standardization and the use of language in psychology. And that led me into a master's program where I studied the kind of the foundation of the APA publication manual, which sounds super dry. It seems like something that it seems that would be kind of silly to study. But in that degree, I got to delve into all these old archives and kind of see what were the kind of conversations happening and all of the kind of minutia from those meetings about how these standards that we use kind of every day now that's just kind of like come part and parcel with our discipline. Well, how are they kind of responses to what was happening in the discipline at large? And so a lot of it comes down to money. A lot of it comes down to funding and of how do we kind of increase the prestige of our discipline. And for instance, our unique way of putting the author in the year of publication in our text when citing references was not standard at the time. And the editors kind of made this decision and had all these kind of conversations about it because they wanted to know, well, whose research were you studying and how recent was it? Because there was all this talk about, well, we want to promote new research, so we want to know whose lab this work is coming from, rather than having all of that information just relegated to an endnote, which you'd have to flip back and forth to see. So there was all these kind of interesting dynamics and stories. But during that degree, I was also interested in quantitative methods and statistics and data analysis. And that ended up that interest opened a lot of doors. I opened with one of my good friends, a statistical consulting company, and we worked with nurses and dentists and kinesiology people and all sorts of different disciplines doing statistical consulting. And I also did a lot of tutoring for intro stats and for advanced stats within the department, which there was always a demand for. And so during this degree, I was really kind of getting interested in quant, but York didn't have a quant area yet. This was something that when I applied to York, was kind of, they were still kind of hashing out the details of what it would look like. And by the time I was finishing my master's degree, it had gotten off the ground. And so this is something I do want to note, that just because you applied into one program for your graduate studies doesn't mean you're locked in there. Oftentimes it is very standard for a student to come into a graduate program under the supervision of one person and stick with them throughout the MA and the PhD. But if it isn't a good fit for you, or if you find something better, most supervisors are here to support you and will be happy to support those experiences. And so while I had a great relationship with my MA supervisor, Dr. Michael Pettit, I realized that, hey, I really wanted to go into quant. It seems like this is really more in line with my interests and my skill set. And Dr. Pettit was extremely supportive of me making this transition and then working under Dr. Michael Friendly, who did a lot of really great work with visualizing data. And so I ended up completing my doctorate degree in quantitative methods at York. And I do want to note that it was really at times very difficult. I ended up taking off almost about a year during those studies to work full-time as a psychometrician at a company in Toronto called MHS. And this is something that as grad students, you do have to kind of navigate. the pressures of completing your dissertation, of fulfilling all these requirements, but also kind of what do you want to be doing with this degree? And MHS was a great fit, but also kind of inspired me as being a kind of that 9 to 5 structure to kind of try to finish the degree and see where that would lead me. And thankfully, it led me here. And so I am, since 2018, been a part of the psychology department at Simon Fraser University. I'm a lecturer in the history, quantitative, and theoretical area. And I also help run the psychological methods consulting group. And as of this September, I've become the associate chair of the department for undergraduate studies. And so I'm truly happy to be here. And I realize that I've gone over my time limit. So I will save my tips for when it comes back to me. But for now, I will pass it on to our next speaker.
All right, we're all good to go there. So, my name's Robin. That's my cat Maui, big 17-pound chonker. Love her so much. Has been such a support during this stressful time. It's like a weighted blanket, you just grab your cat and lean back. Self-care is going to be a big part of what I talk about today. Um, so I am a current master's student at SFU. I've been studying learning and memory using virtual reality technology. My project, essentially, there's a lot of hype in the business world, especially about whether or not virtual reality is going to change the way we do things. And I'm almost proud to be one of the naysayers in the field, where my research finds that the kind of learning you expect to see from a book or from a computer is the same trends of learning that you get from a VR program. Learning seems to be the same no matter how you do it. In fact, it's not whether or not you learn in VR or on a computer or on a book, it's how those programs are designed. Not all textbooks are created equal. I'm sure you've read good textbooks and you've read boring textbooks. Not all computer programs and not all VR programs are created equal. So where the business case is trying to just move forward with, yes, VR, let's go. My research is more like, hey, no, let's slow down. We don't even know how to design these things well yet. So that's sort of my personal research, but I actually started doing expertise research in esports. I've been here with the Cognitive Science Lab under Dr. Mark Blair, where I've been doing my master's for the last, 4 and a bit years. And we study how do people learn skills over time, starting from novices and moving their way all the way up to the top of their field. And what does that process look like? Well, a lot of studies, they just compare the novices to the experts and they see what's different between them. But what our lab does is we say, well, what about all the people in between? If you are wanting to learn how to be a soccer player, should you be studying the top soccer players in the world and practicing like they do? As it turns out, no. It's better to look at the people who are closer in rank to you, because what's important to prioritize in your practice changes as you get better at a skill. So that's a lot of what our work does. We've also done stuff with eye tracking and human computer interaction. And so I've been involved in a lot of really cool projects over the last, 10 years since I started my undergrad here. So but I wanted to talk a little bit about just how did I get here? I think a lot of students in your position, if you're at the end of your undergrad or even in the middle of it and trying to figure out like, okay, what's after my undergrad? I remember being equally confused. I was in a position where I didn't know if I wanted to go into grad school or into industry. And so I'll talk a little bit about what my mindset was when I was a student and show how that transition to, hey, I'm going to go into grad school and I'm feeling more confident about it as I sort of developed. So when I first started my undergrad, actually even back in high school, I wanted to work in video games. Every class I took in every department, I would try and make my project about video games. So if it was anthropology, what's the anthropology of video game players? And I would write my term paper on that. I'd make my own little games using Game Maker, and I'd spend hours building levels. But in high school, I had a big problem from the coding side of things, because I was looking around at the people around me And I'm sure all of you have had this feeling at some point or another where you just feel like everyone in your class is better than you. And when I was a lot younger, I wasn't very kind to myself. To me, this was very discouraging. And I thought, gosh, maybe I don't belong as a programmer. Um, and funnily enough, I got into psychology to avoid programming originally. Um, of course, the irony being, when I got to SFU and I got a tour of the lab here, one of the first questions they asked me was, "Oh, what's your programming background like?" And I had to sort of, yeah, I made some click and drag games. That's programming, right? And sort of faked it till I maked it, and that worked. And then I had to learn. So but back when I was younger, like I said, I wasn't kind to myself. I had this imposter syndrome where I felt like what I knew was so much smaller compared to everyone else. And I wasn't respecting the reality where we all come from our own different specialties and personal experiences. If I did intelligence testing of this Zoom call, you're all probably around the same age group. I'd probably find you're all around the same intelligence level, give or take a little bit. So all of you are around the same intelligence and ability. It's just that you have different specialties. So obviously someone saying this, it's one thing to say, it's another to really internalize it. And it took me a long time to internalize this. Um, but that shifting my mindset from the imposter syndrome over to this more realistic mindset and more forgiving mindset, that's actually what helped me actually finally take the step into grad school. Um, Now, what was funny, of course, like I'm in a psychology program. I didn't go into computer programming because I had found an industry job of video game psychologist. I'd never heard of a video game psychologist. I thought, wow, do these developers need therapy? They're so overworked, like they need an in-house therapist. But as it turns out, they wanted someone to actually apply the principles of psychology to the design of the game. And I thought that was fascinating. I'd never heard of that before. And so I completely changed my school trajectory towards let's do this. Nowadays, I'm not as obsessed with video games, and the same skills that I got into that have now gotten me more into educational roles. But one of the common themes that's come out of my education has been there are so many psychology jobs out there, even outside of academia, that you just don't even know exist. So obviously, being a college teacher or university teacher, one of those, some of my friends in the lab here have gone on from doing research in psychology to HIV research. Turns out those skills were transferable. Market research, one of my roommates who did a master's in psychology here now does market research using statistical modeling for companies. Turns out the same skills they used in their psychology thesis are also good for business. Educational research, I know people who design tests, and of course, user research. A lot of my colleagues now work at, like, say, Google or Ubisoft. If you've ever been banned from your account in Rainbow Six Siege, that's my friend Rollin. So, it's I think, when I ask people, oh, when you think of jobs in psychology, a lot of the time people just think therapy. They don't think of all these other areas where psychology is highly applicable. And I think, especially with that HIV research, there's maybe sometimes a worry of, oh, if I commit to this degree, am I blocking myself from being able to switch to another field later? Absolutely not. The skills that you learn as a researcher are universal to every field for the most part. So, going from psychology to biology research, not so difficult as it turns out. Um, Obviously, learning specialists as well. That's kind of where I've started going into is training people and designing onboarding resources. So yeah, there's just lots of different career paths out there for someone that has a background in psychology. Mine is in education, but yours might be in any of these other areas. Don't just think you have to go into the education pipeline or the academia pipeline. So yeah, the key lessons I learned in my undergrad, at least, were you don't know what your dream job is because you don't know about every job that exists. I'm sure when I put that board up, a lot of you were like, wow, never even heard of some of these statistical positions for business or user research roles. And secondly, being willing to fake it while you make it. Every job I've ever gotten, I have never felt 100% qualified for. Likewise, even when I applied for grad school, I had actually waited a year longer than I needed to because I didn't think I was ready for it. And it was only when I was working in the lab here and the new grad student came in and I was asked to train the grad student. And I thought to myself, wait a minute. If I'm not ready, why am I being asked to train the grad student, you know? So I realized like, okay, I'm being trusted to do this. I can probably do it as well. So, I think we're oftentimes really hard on ourselves. And, bit by bit, obviously, one little presentation isn't going to change your perspective overnight, but work to be more kind to yourself. You are a lot more prepared than you think you are. Um, Although, one of the things that kind of came out of that was that because I had trained this grad student and they were 1 year ahead of me in the program, I had someone that I could follow along with. And so when it came to navigating the trials and tribulations of bureaucracy and paperwork, they went through it so that I didn't have to. I was able to essentially see what challenges they faced, what information they learned as they were going through the program, and not have to go through a lot of those difficulties myself. So one recommendation I highly suggest to you is if you do pursue grad school, make a friend who's like a year ahead of you so that you have someone you can ask about. And I highly recommend that. It's actually a great group of people here. It's going to be pretty easy to make a friend. So a couple of things in sort of like grad school 101. What did I have during my application? Like I said, it's okay to not feel 100% prepared. I did not know that I was prepared, but I asked my supervisor, like, hey, like, had I applied a year earlier, would you have accepted me? And he went, absolutely. Like, why didn't you apply a year earlier? I was waiting for it. I was like, oh, okay. So, being more kind to yourself there. When you're preparing that application, though, one thing that a lot of students don't realize is that it's really about who you want to work with. I did a lot of research going around to different schools, and what's important is, if you're interested in a particular topic, you need to find someone that's actually going to help you get better at that kind of research. And so in my case, there was really no one at UBC or any of the other schools that did the kind of work I wanted to do. It just made more sense to go with my supervisor and do work that I was interested in. Now, during the degree, like I said, it's important. Make friends. It's having a community of learners, not leaners. Oh, you lean on each other too. But if, especially with some of the more difficult classes, this is going to be where your study groups come from. And as someone who teaches the study of how to study, I can tell you right now that communities of learners go farther than any individual can on their own for the most part. Likewise, you get a lot of freedom, at least in the HQT program, to take courses in other departments. Oftentimes, if you are, say, going into industry, well, you're going to need training in qualitative methods. There's no course in the psychology department on qualitative methods. You have to go to criminology or education or CIAT. And each of those departments, of course, have their own angle on how they teach those methods. And so you can go to those professors and do research on what's going to be good for your program. What's beautiful about the HQT track is that it really is a custom-built degree for your research interests. And it's also okay to change your project entirely. I spent 1.5 years of my degree on a StarCraft project. And yeah, Matt, I think you've seen that proposal. My VR research has nothing to do with any of that. I completely started from scratch 1.5 years into my program. That is normal. That is fine. a lot of people get anxiety about that, but it is totally fine to do. You're not starting from scratch, you're starting from experience. So, if you feel like your supervisor and you just aren't clicking on it one project, maybe it's time to switch tracks. Just don't do it too often. As well, taking care of yourself. I think this is something I've seen so many of my friends who have gone through their grad school experiencing burnout and mental health struggles. It is important to not neglect your personal care. I think especially, I've got little mantras that I tell myself, like full belly, full life, don't forget to eat. um, and that goes a long way in terms of helping you to maintain the kind of performance that you want to keep up. So taking care of yourself and being kind to yourself. Some final notes. Like I said, I completely changed what I wanted to do during my master's, not just in terms of the project I did, but my career trajectory as well. I no longer want to go into user research for video games. I ended up taking a bunch of courses in the education department and have now kind of really fallen in love with a brand new career path. Because I did that exploration, I found more jobs I'd never heard of and fell in love with them, and I'm applying to a few of those right now. And lastly, and this is, I think, the most important thing, is that every single work opportunity I've gotten has been because I've met amazing people and built relationships with them. I did a research contract last spring for BD School of Business. And in part, it was because in one of my education courses that had two teachers, I'd gotten to know them really well. We had great conversations. And they were in a meeting with someone else who was saying, hey, I need someone to do an education project in technology. Both of them typed my name into the chat at the same time. That relationship led to a really nice position, and that position has led to another position that Matt and I should email each other and talk about soon, because now my workload is decreasing and I can chat with you now. Let's set that up. Popped into my head there. So, it's even the first research job I had outside of academia was with a food kit delivery company, which I got not at a conference, but I was walking home from the conference and I bumped into one of my old regulars from when I worked at Starbucks, who works at Hootsuite, and one of his friends and we went to go grab burritos at like 2 a.m. And as I was explaining the kind of research I was looking into at the conference, the friend goes, hey, you know what? I've got a project for you. And literally with beans spilling down my shirt, I got offered a job. So, it really is about the relationships you make in the program in addition to the learning. So, yeah, I think that's all I've got. We can save more for the Q&A, I think.
So I actually started at SFU in 2014, which feels like a long, long time ago because it is. But yeah, so I started actually right after graduation from high school. I graduated high school in June and started in September. So 2014 was kind of like 3 months of 2014. But anyways, so yeah, I was just in FAS and I actually did my first year at the Surrey campus, and I can't remember what the little program I was in, but it was like fast start go. I don't know. There was like 30 students in it. So I did take Psych 100 and 102, but those were the only, and 106 was a random special topics course. But those were the only psych courses that were offered or that I could take that I took that year. I took some crim courses and stuff. I honestly don't remember this year very much. I think it went good. I think I was just like not that stressed and kind of vibing. I definitely I definitely got my worst grades in this year, as people often say in their first year. So not that I wasn't stressed at all, but yeah, moving into 2015 is when I realized that I really wanted to go into clinical psychology. So in high school, I decided to go into psychology in general. I obviously you all know that you don't pick your major right away, but that was kind of my idea. And I know it's going to sound like I had a very linear path, that in high school I wanted to do psych, and guess what I'm doing? But it was a little twisty and turny, at least from my perspective. So I'll get into that. But yeah, in high school, I had a few different mental health issues. I had an eating disorder and other things, and that led to inpatient treatment, and that's what kind of got me into psychology. My treatment didn't have much psychology, and I was like, hey, think we're missing out on something. It was really focused on the physiology behind eating disorders, which is obviously very important as well. But yeah, so I really was drawn to kind of the psychology behind it, and that led me to SFU. 2015, I realized that I did really like all those like second year psych courses. So I took what I think is very poorly named abnormal psychology with Shannon Zaitsoff, and I took like social psych, developmental psych, all the psychs. And I was really excited to take the course with Shannon Zaitsoff because I noticed that she ran the eating disorder lab at SFU. So I went up a little eager undergrad and expressed that I really would love to do research in eating disorders. And I did a little too much self-disclosure. I was like, in high school, which wasn't necessary, but it didn't backfire too badly at all. But she didn't have opportunities at that time. But she said just like keep an eye out. And I can't remember how I heard about it. I think I just applied a couple different semesters until she had an active project going on. So that's another thing to consider. It's not really like it's just like the job market that you can apply to somewhere. If they're not hiring, they're not hiring. Like if she doesn't have work for me to do, she doesn't have work for me to do. And in this kind of part of my education, I definitely wasn't ready to do independent research quite yet. I was just kind of dipping my toes in. But eventually in 2016, her PhD student, Rochelle Palmer, started her research, and they needed help collecting data at local high schools. And that's where I came in. So I joined the lab. I did very classic, like 8 hours of data entry a week just on SPSS. I went to different high schools and handed out questionnaires and weighed the people. And I also helped that grad student with a systematic review. She just asked me and another undergrad, which is a very great thing about being in such a small lab. At the time, Shannon only had one grad student. Right now she has three, so she's kind of building a little bit. But at the time she only had one. So that grad student looked at us undergrads to help her with her research, which was great for me because eventually that research did get published. And that was one of the major publications on my application. And unfortunately, publications are very helpful when applying, even though it is a lot to ask of an undergrad. Posters are also great. So there's a lot of other things to do as well, but that did get published in the Journal of Adolescence. So that was really great. I think it got published in 2019. But yeah, so this is about 3 years that I was just working in undergrad. So this was a lot of work and I did a lot of different things trying to be competitive for grad school. So also in 2016, I started volunteering at the Looking Glass Foundation for Eating Disorders. And I would meet with an individual in recovery from an eating disorder once a week in person and just provide peer support. And I'd also do like an online support thing. And that's actually one way they put it that's really good. It's like the journal that writes back. So people would just kind of write whenever they needed to, and you'd write back within like 24 or 48 hours, which are both programs that they still have going on. So if anyone's interested in volunteering or needs support, there's a little plug. And other things I did at this time was I realized that I needed more references for grad applications. So I tried to get into other labs that kind of were around the same topics. And that led me to Dr. Marlene Moretti's Adolescent Health Lab. And this one I also applied to a couple times, and they weren't like taking people, or they didn't have a space for me until Marlene chaired this conference that was hosted here in Vancouver. And as you guys can probably imagine, a conference is a lot of work to organize. There's a lot of logistics and a lot of side things. And I'd always take like the jack of all trades approach to being an RA. She was like, we need someone to take pictures. And then we're talking about just using their phones. And I have a DSLR camera. And I was like, hey, I can do that. And yeah, I just kind of got involved helping with that conference, and they never got rid of me after that. So I just helped with a few different projects. By this time, I started in the adolescent health lab in 2019. So I worked mostly in Shannon's lab for most of undergrad. And yeah, so I also did like some research engagement and directed study courses more at this point in my career, my education. And those, you guys probably all know what those are, but more independent kind of research and work. I did one directed studies with Marlene, which was another systematic review. And I also did, I think, 3 of these different undergraduate student research awards, which I highly, highly recommend if you're ever able to kind of get that opportunity. If you're working as an RA, I'd highly recommend kind of looking into it because you might be able to get paid for the work you're already doing. So those I highly recommend looking into as well. But this part took me a while because even though it seems pretty straightforward, like I said, um, I did have some troubles here, and it actually is really funny because I struggled a lot with stats. I did fine in 210, and like I got like an A or something, nothing, it was quite good. But then that 300 really got me. I took it, I think I dropped it like at least twice, maybe 3 times. I had so much anxiety surrounding it, kind of what Robin was just talking about. I was really kind of questioning if I could do it. I was like, if I can't get this stats course, how am I gonna figure it out? And I think just the way it was being taught didn't vibe with how I think of stats. So the teacher was amazing, but it just gave me a lot of anxiety. But in the future, and I promise I didn't plan this, but Matt Sigal actually started teaching the upper division stats course that you need to go into honors. And he uses R, which I thought was super interesting. I'd never coded or anything before. So it was a bit more practical and applied, which really kind of vibed with how I was thinking. And I got through the course and did just fine, which brought me to 2020, which is I did my honors from 2019 to 2020 with Shannon, Dr. Zaitzoff, and I'd actually proposed the project in like a seminar course that I took with her in the spring of 2019. So those are really great ways also to get connected with profs. They're usually quite small courses, maybe like I think this one was actually only like 5 people, but they kind of range from like 5 to 20 sort of thing. So yeah, I started my honors in 2019 and I actually came up with a study, I actually made some of the questionnaires and collected all the data all by myself. It was virtual, so that was nice. And I finished data collection in February of 2019, which was very helpful. I mean, of 2020, which was very helpful given what everyone knows happened in March of 2020. So as you guys can imagine, that my end of my honors was kind of interrupted by a pandemic. It was interesting though, because everyone was having a really hard time with quarantine, and it made me really realize that a lot of my life was called quarantine, that I didn't realize that a lot of what I do is just sitting around doing research and I should get out. But yeah, so I finished in 2020. That's a very poor edit of me that I posted on Instagram of me pretending to graduate because I couldn't graduate yet. Um, and this was also when I started TAing, which I loved. So I TA'd Psych 300 throughout 2020 and 2021. And I really liked that. And it kind of affirmed that I would really like the teaching side of being a psychologist. And I really liked research, as I kind of didn't talk about that too much, but I did actually really like it. I didn't just do it because it was a means to an end. And then the clinical side of things was actually something that was really hard to decide to determine if I'd like in undergrad, because understandably you need some training before you can work in a clinical setting. So the Looking Glass Foundation was really big for that, and that helped. But again, it's peer support and it's very specific what kind of things I can and can't do. I've heard a lot of people get experience with the crisis line, which is good, but that's also like not completely representative of what you do because every single person that's calling is in crisis. So that can be really heavy. But if you like that, then you probably will like any clinical work. But yeah, so that was actually the part that I hadn't had as much experience with by the time I was applying, that I had some anxiety surrounding. I was really excited to do it. I've been wanting to for a long time. But yeah, so in 2021 I applied, and I actually wasn't planning on applying because I hadn't written the GRE, and then they got rid of the GRE, so I was like, let's do it. So I applied, and I applied to 5 schools here: UBC, Western, UC San Diego, because I was just kind of dreaming a little bit there, and McMaster. And I do see SDSU UC San Diego is a joint program, but I was really surprised when I was looking into these to find out that grad school in the US is actually pretty comparable in price to here, because most of the programs have tuition remission. You don't actually pay tuition, the crazy tuition fees that you tend to pay in undergrad in the US. So most of the APA accredited programs do have that. There's obviously visas and all that, which I can't help you with, but that's something to consider, not to write it off completely, because we know that undergrad there is so much more expensive. But anyways, I only got interviews at SFU and UBC. And then I got an offer at SFU, and I took it. So I began in 2021, and I'll get it going here. I actually didn't time myself, so I should have checked on that. But yeah, so I began in 2021, and the first year is very course heavy. But I loved having a cohort. So in the honors year, you have a cohort, but you only get them for like 1 semester. And there's usually not too many people like in your lab and stuff, but there's only 6 people in my cohort. So we all got very close, and we'd like go, we'd like hang out after afternoon classes and stuff. But yeah, so first year is a lot of thinking about my thesis and what I want to do. Matt Sigal was on my committee, so I probably asked him to look at my proposal that year. And then by 2022 is when I started to get to do clinical work for real. So in our program, first year of your master's is very coursework heavy. And second year is when you start seeing a therapy client and you start going on practicum. So I started seeing my first therapy client through the Clinical Psychology Center at SFU, which has been just an incredible learning experience and so rewarding. And I also started my practicum doing psychoeducational assessments at Sharon Arnold and Associates. And this is something that like has really helped me to like branch out, because if there was an option to do like a therapy practicum, or especially like an eating disorder one, I would have done that, but there wasn't. So I branched out and tried something new, and I absolutely loved it. This kind of gets into, I'm really interested to look into some of Robin's work because of what we look at in the reports and all the recommendations we give to try and support kiddos with their learning. And then, yeah, so I did that, which I loved so much that I took autism assessment training, and I'm finishing an autism assessment practicum with Sharon as well right now, which has also been awesome. During all of that time, I don't even think I mentioned this, but my supervisor right now is Marlene Moretti. I loved her research in adolescent health. I started to really recognize kind of that comorbidity is really the norm, not the exception, that almost everybody has at least one disorder that I'd see. And to be honest, I probably would have applied to both her and Shannon if they were both taking students. I really loved both their research paths, but only Marlene was taking students. So I applied and I got in. And yeah, we kind of decided to look more at like transdiagnostic, which like factors that would impact a lot of different disorders, from eating disorders to mood disorders, whatever it is. So like emotion regulation is a big one that I look at. Yeah, so during that time, I did a research, and I did a network analysis, which is way too much to explain right now, but it was a cool way of visualizing basically measures that my lab has always used, and it was quite complex. So I was able to break my master's thesis into kind of 3 different projects, which allowed me to go to a conference in Lisbon in 2022, which has definitely been a highlight of my graduate school experience so far. And I also presented another portion of it in San Diego in 2023. And I did, those weren't completely funded. I did fund myself to get there. I do get some support from the department. I've got, my funding was $900 a year for these, which is generous, but not enough to get to Portugal, as you can imagine. But this is one of my favorite parts of research of going to conferences and getting to share my work and travel. And yeah, so 2024, now I finished my master's in September of 2023, or August of 2023, and I started my PhD in September, and I've just been chugging along at that. And I'll let you know how it keeps going. But I just told my like whole story, and it was a lot, but yeah, I've really loved grad school so far. Second year, everything was very stressful, but I think something that I kind of realized once I started seeing clients that really kind of motivates me is that like in undergrad, I was so focused on studying and working so hard to get an A plus in whatever a professor decided they want to test. No offense, Matt Sigal, but it felt a little like, okay, I have a test, I'll study, blah, blah, blah. But then by grad school, I started to realize, okay, I really need to learn how to do this IQ test so I can help this little girl that I have an assessment with next month. So I'd see like the background and I'd be like, oh, I really want to do this one with her. I should learn that. So that's kind of a big thing for me. And a big thing in grad school has also been letting go of being perfectionistic. And it's so hypocritical to say because they really make us be perfectionistic to get into clinical grad school and grad school in general. But clinical is really ridiculous. It just gets worse and worse every year. The GPA is kind of a baseline. They sometimes expect to have publications and stuff. There's a lot that they're asking of you. And then when you get to grad school, you have to remember that you are just a student clinician and it's okay to make mistakes and you're expected to. And that's been kind of really helped me to get a weight off my shoulders and not feel so pressured to be perfect all the time. But yeah, the work's a lot different. It's a lot more experiential and hands-on, and I can answer any questions you guys have. I kind of just rambled it to you, but yeah, thanks for listening.
Yes, thank you, Sherene, for sharing your journey with us all. And thank you to all of our speakers today. Related with what you folks mentioned in terms of imposter syndrome and also being kind to yourself. I had a little bit of a crisis last night, actually. So thank you for that reminder. I think not just for grad students, but also for undergrads and also even for staff, just being kind to ourselves is really important at the same. We have about half an hour, I think, for the Q&A. So I think it's a pretty good time in terms of answering the questions. I'll head over to Justine as well.
Yes. Maybe just to get the ball rolling, I do have one question that I'd like to ask the speakers. And I think this is a question that a lot of our audience members are curious about too.
Yeah.
And that is, considering how competitive psychology graduate school can be, how can students make their applications stand out against other candidates? So whoever wants to take a stab at that.
Yeah, I would like to, I'll start and pass it on to whoever. But one of the things that I was kind of encouraged to me during my honors seminar, but also that I always tell students is that really getting in touch with a potential supervisor beforehand. So like even before you start thinking about like actually submitting your application, doing that research and figuring out what are they interested in and how does that gel with my interests? What I think sometimes students don't realize is that if you can make that interpersonal connection in advance, like so we kind of my partner and I, when we were applying to grad school, we interviewed with the potential supervisor before even saying, hey, like, do you want to be my supervisor? It was like, hey, we looked at your research and we thought this was really interesting, or these aspects were kind of neat. And this is where it kind of gels with my academic history and my interests, and you kind of become more of a person to them. And that really does help because a lot of the weight of are we going to accept this student or not comes down to that individual supervisor's decision about do I have the resources to take on this student? And if they have that connection to you, they will go to bat for you, even if your grades are perhaps a little bit lower or you don't have as much experience doing XYZ as another applicant. If you have had that personal connection and they see you as a person that they connect with and they can work with, a graduate degree is such a monumental task in terms of, like, you're thinking about at least around 2 years for a master's degree, around 4 for a doctorate. That's a lot of time to spend with someone. And so if you have that, if you start off on that foot of, hey, I respect the work that you've done and we get along as people, that sets the stage. Whereas a lot of the time we will get messages from students being like, oh, I applied to your school and put you as a potential supervisor. And you're like, well, I have no history with you, and that would be a major impediment to an application like that. So really thinking about kind of like making those connections and finding what you are interested in, what do you want to pursue. If you say to a supervisor, hey, I'm really interested in your research on this, but then you propose a project that's completely unrelated, that would be kind of a red flag as well. So kind of like making sure to kind of align your interests with the supervisors that you are wanting to study with. And also follow the application requirements to the letter. If it requires a certain number of letters of reference, or if it requires you to talk about a certain thing in your personal statement, make sure that that actually gets addressed, because a lot of the time the rubrics that the admissions committee will look for, so separate from the supervisor, is they will go through a checklist and be like, all right, did they submit this? Do they have whatever this prerequisite or this requirement? And if you don't have that, then the application might just get kind of put aside or granted lower priority than someone who just kind of diligently went through those checklists. And so a lot of schools will have requirements and will have recommendations for potential applicants. Make sure to follow all of those details.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you, Matt. And I think the overlap is so important when it comes to picking the right supervisor. And this actually is a good segue into the next question, which is a top question. So not sure, maybe Sherene or Robin, if you want to take a stab at it, but do you have any suggestions for getting a supervisor? Any tips or advice to for you in terms of for students who want to get a supervisor in psychology?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in on this one.
Mm.
So in my case, I had actually been working with Dr. Blair for a number of years as a volunteer research assistant in the lab doing work here, to the point where when it was time for me to apply, I applied to Dr. Blair. And when I was getting a reference letter, I got a reference letter from Dr. Blair. So one of my references was actually the person I was applying to. That's a thing you can do. So, Dr. Blair had to actually write a letter to himself, which was, I imagine, quite funny for him. But in terms of how do you get other people to be on your references list as well, every class you take, it's well worth it to go up after class and talk to your professors and your instructors, because those are the people that are going to go to bat for you later on. And if they don't know your name, especially, at SFU, you are in a class of 200 other students. And I can tell you, as going through the instructor process right now, there's maybe I only have a class of 90. There's only maybe 7 students who I really know well enough to maybe vouch for them a little bit. The rest just have not engaged with me. And I'm not going to make the effort to engage with you, other than, my educational duties, of course. So yeah, after class, just go up and ask a question or talk about something. Like Dr. Wright has a really good class that he does where, he turns off his mic and recording and talks about what the reference letter process looks like. And yeah, just, go up and talk. If he's into playing guitar, you talk about guitar even. Building an authentic relationship with that person is so important. If you're not working with that person, I've actually talked with a few students who got accepted into the program here who didn't have a previous relationship with the supervisors they applied to. And the biggest thing for those students was reaching out in advance, asking about specific kinds of research that professor was involved in, and getting an informational interview, just being like, hey, like, do you think I would be a good fit for this program? And, you know, a lot of professors are willing to have a conversation, or at least refer you to their graduate students, so that, you know, maybe they don't have time to talk to you, but they can refer you to their grad students to be like, is this a good fit? So there's multiple ways that might improve your probability of getting a supervisor, but I'd say the key thing, like Matt was saying, is just building those authentic connections with people.
Thank you, Robin. Sherene, if you want to add on, I think there's also another question that you might be able to answer. The second question here, what is the difference between a master's in counseling psychology and a master's in clinical psychology, which I'm sure comes up a lot. So Sherene, if you want to answer that, and provide any other advice for our students here.
Totally, of course. So for one of my suggestions for getting a supervisor, especially early on when you're kind of exploring what areas of research you like, is, well, at least what I did was really try it and offer to be a jack of all trades. So a lot of professors are really trying to improve their websites or their social media presence, and they might not feel very comfortable with that. And you probably have skills that are marketable that you don't really recognize just by virtue of, I'm assuming, your guys' age and stuff, but by virtue of being younger. But another thing that I would like to say, what was it? That makes your application stand out. Oh, something that I was very focused on in undergrad was like, oh, I need to finish. I had so much anxiety about it taking 6 years to finish my undergrad, and if that would be brought up throughout interviews and stuff. No one said anything about it. And there were a couple semesters, like I said, where I withdrew, and it was like withdrew with extenuating circumstances or just a W. And I was very anxious about that as well. And I'd like consult with a couple different profs and get kind of mixed feedback on how that would be interpreted and the impact of it. So there was a lot of anxiety I had surrounding that none of it came to fruition. Like it never got mentioned once. So try not to let single thing, like things that can be kind of minor, get in the way. And also I was always in a really big rush to start, and there really is no rush to start. That it's almost like, I think a lot of the more senior students are a lot more prepared for clinical programs. It's a lot of responsibility and a lot of work, is a lot different than undergrad. And since it's so applied, you want to make sure that you're kind of ready for that. So don't rush so much. I know a ton of people that maybe have worked in clinics, even if they're just kind of as support people and stuff like that, or admin, and that can kind of help as well. So the difference between masters in counseling and clinical psychology, there's a big one. It's big, and I have a really good document that I can put in the chat for people to reference, and it's by Dr. Mitch Prinstein, I believe. And he is a professor in the US, so this is kind of US based, but to be honest, it's very, very similar, even counseling and clinical in the US. So this has a lot of information about about applying to clinical. And the first section is, do you really want to be a clinical psychologist? So as there's kind of a lot of different things that you can do. And I actually gave, like when I was TAing Psych 300, I would kind of meet with students that were interested and give like a little optional lecture on what what you could do in grad school and kind of what is going on there. So I do have a slide. Is it okay if I overrun the thing? Cool. So this is like one thing that's really important to think about is, do you really want to do research and clinical practice? And above that, do you want to be able to diagnose people? So that's a huge difference between being a psychologist and being a counselor, in almost every province, I think, except Alberta, you need a PhD to be a psychologist or a PsyD. And to diagnose people, you either have to be a physician or a psychologist. So to do the assessments that I've been doing in terms of psychoeducational and diagnosing like ADHD and learning disabilities, autism, obviously all the emotional disorders from like personality disorders, a lot of people do forensic like risk and violence assessments. But assessments are really the thing that is kind of unique to clinical psychologists that we can do, and that counselors and other professionals, although they can be trained in the measures and stuff like that, they can't interpret them in the same way that psychologists are able to. So if you are really, if you're interested in diagnosing, which can sound kind of weird, but I've honestly loved that aspect of it. I love taking all the tests and putting the puzzle pieces together and seeing like the match between what this kid was telling me and what I see on their different tests and measures, and it's really cool. So I love that aspect of it. But if you just want to do therapy, there is a lot easier ways to become a therapist. And a lot of psychologists, there are a lot of psychologists that do full-time therapy, but full-time therapy for a psychologist is really inaccessible to the public. At BC Children's and other hospitals, they do have quite a few psychologists on staff, but most hospitals have like one or two. Like, so there's not many public health settings where you can get therapy from a psychologist, and the going rate right now that the College of Psychologists requires or recommends psychologists offer their services at is $225 an hour, which is very expensive. So not always the most affordable way to do therapy, so that would impact the clients that you get to see and stuff like that. So all of these are kind of different ways, other clinical areas that you can consider. Social work, I think though these programs can be a lot different. Counseling psychology is really more focused on counseling and therapy. And I think these programs differ quite a bit. So ours is an education program. And I did see one question about if I have an MA or MED, and I do have an MA. So our clinical program is kind of like a joint program. When you get accepted, you're expected to do both your MA and PhD if you get accepted in the MA level. And I know I'm talking a lot right now, but yeah, so there are all these other areas where you can be working with clinical populations and not have to spend 6 years in school becoming a doctor. If you want to diagnose or do research or be in academia, then the clinical psychology is right for you. But if you want to just do therapy or speech language pathology is another really relevant area if you want to work with kids, counseling psychology, obviously. There are kind of easier ways to do it. And on the vice versa, there's more efficient ways to become a researcher than doing clinical psychology if you don't want to do, you can do clinical research without being a clinical psychologist. So you can research clinical topics without having like therapy training and stuff. So that's, you really like research and aren't interested in like the applied side, then that's another track to kind of consider. So I think that's basically what I wanted to say about that one. I know it's a huge topic and there's like a lot to consider in that. I personally, like, I kind of am glad I didn't know, because I'm really happy with where I've ended up in the career options I have, because I'm really excited that I can teach, or I can do research, or I can work in private practice 2 days a week and work like at BC Children's another 2 days a week when I finish, sort of thing. It's really flexible. But at the beginning of grad school, I mean, at the beginning of undergrad, I probably would have loved to like do the counseling and human development minor. I believe that's what it was.
Yeah.
But I actually never found out about it until I was like almost done undergrad. So I probably would have done that if I had a chance. So I would highly recommend doing, at least taking some of those classes to see if counseling is something you're interested in.
Yes, thank you, Sherene. I think this question comes up a lot in my appointments with students. They are always wondering, the difference between counseling and also with clinical psychology. So thank you for sharing that with us today. Let's move on to the next question here. Let's take a look. The next question might be for Robin. So the question here, Robin mentioned some extra job opportunities that were open for them after taking classes in education. Could they expand on those a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I think is important to acknowledge is that most students who go through a BA program don't go into a master's program. And so what I found, at least originally I wanted to do video game psychology. Turns out in a lot of spaces that's called user research. And the tools that are used in user research, certainly having a psychology background has helped me. But I did find that the focus on statistical training in this department was a limitation in terms of my hireability. By going to education, I was able to get training in qualitative methods, thematic coding, case studies, things like that, that isn't offered in the psychology department courses. And that is what has actually allowed me to have more conversations with people in other industries. So my psychology background in terms of the mindset, the knowledge of human learning, that has been instrumental in giving me an edge in those spaces, because I certainly come at it with a more, I've got the quantitative research to back up a lot of the ideas that I'm supporting in terms of a lot of businesses have training specialists, for instance. And out of one of my contracts, I ended up working for a car dealership. One of their training specialists actually had new onboarding. They were new to the company, and they were evaluating the onboarding procedures for new sales reps. And they wanted someone to look at the interview data and analyze it, and give them feedback on what these new employees were actually needing. And because I had training both as a psychology researcher and in qualitative methods, which I got through education, that allowed me to actually be able to feel confident in accepting that job. Likewise, because I took the certificate program in university teaching and learning during my master's program here, that has led me to actually being able to secure a teaching position, even though I'm not a PhD student. One of the requirements on the job application for being a sessional instructor is that you are a PhD student or have equivalent experience, and that certificate counted as my equivalent experience. So because I had that, and the final project for that course was to redesign a course of your choosing, and I was applying for the course that I had done my final project in. And again, because I had authentic connections with people who believed in me and gave me amazing reference letters. Thank you, Matt. Maybe have another one coming for you, by the way. I had an interview earlier and it went really well. Because of my educational background, it started to open up a lot of other opportunities. It's something where, because I wasn't so specialized, a lot of people in HQT or social, cognitive, and neural, there's kind of an expectation that you're going for the PhD and then you're going to become, I suppose, a university level researcher. But if you are going into industry, you really need to think about the breadth of your knowledge and the applicability of your skills to a diverse range of topics and domains. So that's what I guess was the key thing there.
Yes, thank you, Robin. I think the transferability of your skills is super important. And I remember in your PowerPoint, you were mentioning about the jobs. And I think a lot of students think that if you major in psychology, the only options are, counseling, right, or clinical. But the fact is there's a ton of jobs out there that we don't know about that you could pursue after graduation. So for the next few questions, they are a little bit related, so I will just kind of combine them. So they are related to GPA. So the question, my GPA is 2.7. I can maybe get it up to a 3.1 by the end of my diploma. How can I and should I pursue a master's? I want to be a clinical therapist. Any guidance? And the second question here, when faced with low grades in terms of your GPA, how do you manage to improve your academic performance what actions did you take to raise your GPA? Because as we know, clinical psychology and also counseling, their GPA requirements are quite high. I know, Sherene, you're also smiling here. So if any of you want to jump in and provide any advice for that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so for clinical psychology programs, you do usually need a lot of programs, including SFUs, have a minimum GPA requirement of 3.5 because it's expected that you apply for funding from like the Canadian Institute of Health Research, the Social Sciences, Humanities Research, those funding agencies, and those applications require a 3.5. I'm not so familiar with the GPA requirements in counseling. I do know that it is possible to get in with a 3.5, and it kind of comes down to building those relationships with professors and putting in, yeah, the work to kind of support them in different ways, whether that be like doing a lot of research assistant work and independent projects, kind of making up for maybe the weaker part of your application with stronger like experience. And then one thing that people used to say was that you can maybe, if you have a high GRE score, then you can kind of make the argument that you might have just had a hard time in these years, but you are capable. I'm really not sure if that argument still holds. I know you can still do the GRE, and some programs still require it. Some of them let you submit your scores with your application, but some don't. They don't want to see them even if you have done it. So always look into that in terms of your program. You might be able to kind of make up for a lower GPA with high GRE scores. And yeah, in terms of how to help yourself like improve your grades and studying and stuff like that, it can be I think what Robin mentioned in terms of having a community is really helpful. So studying with other people, even though it can sometimes be a distraction, if you're actually studying, it can help a lot. From a cognitive perspective, those memories are encoded differently because you'll kind of remember the memory of talking to your friend about the subject versus the memory of reading a textbook, sort of thing. So finding ways to really apply the knowledge by talking about it or trying to come up with different questions for yourself, like really thinking about like not just taking notes, but looking at your notes and be like, what kind of question could they ask about that? And I guess in later years too, if you're a lot better at writing papers than you are at test taking, kind of looking into syllabi before enrolling in courses and prioritizing classes that kind of cater to your strengths. So some of those smaller seminar courses they don't usually have exams. They're usually more like a big paper and a presentation or something like that. So really focusing on those kind of things too, and just seeing how courses evaluate and playing to your strengths would probably help too.
Yes, thank you, Sherene. I'm just looking over here for some of the other questions. So now we're getting a few questions about finding jobs. And I know, Matt, you had mentioned that you worked a little bit as well. So the question here is, what are some places to look for psychology-related jobs for those who are not necessarily interested in research? Another question here as well, like in terms of finding jobs, where to look aside from LinkedIn. So any tips you might have for the job hunt for our students?
Yeah, so there are, I think, a lot of positions available once you start kind of broadening that search. It does depend on what you focus on, but certain skills are more, I guess, are more transferable than others. For me personally, going from quantitative methods, it turns out that quantitative methods across many fields is very similar. And what just changes is the kind of the focus of the phenomena that you're measuring. And so whether it's a psychological data set, whether it's a physiological data set, whether it's economic or political or what have you, a lot of the skills that you would gain learning statistics and these data analysis methods through psychology can be applied relatively straightforwardly to these other domains. And pretty much everyone is awash in data these days. And so when you have a lot of these skills, people are looking for things like data scientists who are able to take data, who are able to kind of find meaning within kind of this sea of numbers, and then do some knowledge translation and actually make it understandable to people who don't have that training and don't have those backgrounds. So that's a really important skill that you do pick up in one of our degrees. But in terms of actually like finding the jobs, yeah, you're just looking at a lot of the time you're looking at talking to advisors and talking to your supervisors and seeing kind of what connections do they have in the community. A lot of the time we have students going into nonprofits and going into different kind of political arenas, but also business. There's like tons of different places are looking for people with the skills that you would pick up in a psych degree, but you're not really kind of, I don't think there are very many websites that are like particular for us, just like these are just our jobs. But there's a lot of word of mouth, especially if you end up going into academia. A lot of the job postings, just kind of making sure you're like, hey, these are the institutions that I would like to teach at. They do have little kind of sub websites on those where they post their new job ads. And so kind of keeping track of those sites and kind of keeping them bookmarked and revisiting them every once in a while would be really helpful.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Let's move on to the next question here. Let's take a look. The next question might be for Robin. So the question here, Robin mentioned some extra job opportunities that were open for them after taking classes in education. Could they expand on those a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I think is important to acknowledge is that most students who go through a BA program don't go into a master's program. And so what I found, at least originally I wanted to do video game psychology. Turns out in a lot of spaces that's called user research. And the tools that are used in user research, certainly having a psychology background has helped me. But I did find that the focus on statistical training in this department was a limitation in terms of my hireability. By going to education, I was able to get training in qualitative methods, thematic coding, case studies, things like that, that isn't offered in the psychology department courses. And that is what has actually allowed me to have more conversations with people in other industries. So my psychology background in terms of the mindset, the knowledge of human learning, that has been instrumental in giving me an edge in those spaces, because I certainly come at it with a more, I've got the quantitative research to back up a lot of the ideas that I'm supporting in terms of like, a lot of businesses have training specialists, for instance. And out of one of my contracts, I ended up working for a car dealership. One of their training specialists actually had new onboarding. They were new to the company, and they were evaluating the onboarding procedures for new sales reps. And they wanted someone to look at the interview data and analyze it and give them feedback on what these new employees were actually needing. And because I had training both as a psychology researcher and in qualitative methods, which I got through education, that allowed me to actually be able to feel confident in accepting that job. Likewise, because I took the certificate program in university teaching and learning during my master's program here, that has led me to actually being able to secure a teaching position, even though I'm not a PhD student. One of the requirements on the job application for being a sessional instructor is that you are a PhD student or have equivalent experience, and that certificate counted as my equivalent experience. So because I had that, and the final project for that course was to redesign a course of your choosing, and I was applying for the course that I had done my final project in. And again, because I had authentic connections with people who believed in me and gave me amazing reference letters. Thank you, Matt. Maybe have another one coming for you, by the way. I had an interview earlier and it went really well. So because of my educational background, it started to open up a lot of other opportunities. So yeah, it's something where because I wasn't so specialized, A lot of people in HQT or social, cognitive, and neural, there's kind of an expectation that you're going for the PhD and then you're going to become, I suppose, a university level researcher. But if you are going into industry, you really need to think about the breadth of your knowledge and the applicability of your skills to a diverse range of topics and domains. So that's what I guess was the key thing there.
Yes, thank you, Robin. I think the transferability of your skills is super important. And I remember in your PowerPoint, you were mentioning about the jobs. And I think a lot of students think that if you major in psychology, the only options are, counseling, right? Or clinical. But the fact is there's a ton of jobs out there that we don't know about that you could pursue after graduation. So for the next few questions, they are a little bit related. So I will just kind of combine them. So they are related to GPA. So the question, my GPA is 2.7. I can maybe get it up to a 3.1 by the end of my diploma. How can I and should I pursue a master's? I want to be a clinical therapist. Any guidance? And the second question here, when faced with low grades in terms of your GPA, how do you manage to improve your academic performance? What actions did you take to raise your GPA? Because as we know, clinical psychology and also counseling, their GPA requirements are quite high. I know, Sherene, you're also smiling here. So if any of you want to jump in and provide any advice for that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so for clinical psychology programs, you do usually need a lot of programs, including SFUs, have a minimum GPA requirement of 3.5 because it's expected that you apply for funding from like the Canadian Institute of Health Research, the Social Sciences, Humanities Research, those funding agencies, and those applications require a 3.5. I'm not so familiar with the GPA requirements in counseling. I do know that it is possible to get in with a 3.5, and it kind of comes down to building those relationships with professors and putting in, the work to kind of support them in different ways, whether that be like doing a lot of research assistant work and independent projects, kind of making up for maybe the weaker part of your application with stronger like experience. And then one thing that people used to say was that you can maybe, if you have a high GRE score, then you can kind of make the argument that you might have just had a hard time in these years, but you are capable. I'm really not sure if that argument still holds. I know you can still do the GRE, and some programs still require it. Some of them let you submit your scores with your application, but some don't. They don't want to see them even if you have done it. So always look into that in terms of your program. You might be able to kind of make up for a lower GPA with high GRE scores. And yeah, in terms of how to help yourself like improve your grades and studying and stuff like that, it can be I think what Robin mentioned in terms of having a community is really helpful. So studying with other people, even though it can sometimes be a distraction, if you're actually studying, it can help a lot. From a cognitive perspective, those memories are encoded differently because you'll kind of remember the memory of talking to your friend about the subject versus the memory of reading a textbook, sort of thing. So finding ways to really apply the knowledge by talking about it, or trying to come up with different questions for yourself, like really thinking about like not just taking notes, but looking at your notes and be like, what kind of question could they ask about that? And I guess in later years too, if you're a lot better at writing papers than you are at test taking, kind of looking into syllabi before enrolling in courses and prioritizing classes that kind of cater to your strengths. So some of those smaller seminar courses they don't usually have exams. They're usually more like a big paper and a presentation or something like that. So really focusing on those kind of things too, and just seeing how courses evaluate and playing to your strengths would probably help too.
Yes, thank you, Sherene. I'm just looking over here for some of the other questions. So now we're getting a few questions about finding jobs. And I know, Matt, you had mentioned that you worked a little bit as well. So the question here is, what are some places to look for psychology-related jobs for those who are not necessarily interested in research? Another question here as well, like in terms of finding jobs, where to look aside from LinkedIn. So any tips you might have for the job hunt for our students?
Yeah, so there are, I think, a lot of positions available once you start kind of broadening that search. It does depend on what you focus on, but certain skills are more, I guess, are more transferable than others. For me personally, going from quantitative methods, it turns out that quantitative methods across many fields is very similar. And what just changes is the kind of the focus of the phenomena that you're measuring. And so whether it's a psychological data set, whether it's a physiological data set, whether it's economic or political or what have you, a lot of the skills that you would gain learning statistics and these data analysis methods through psychology can be applied relatively straightforwardly to these other domains. And pretty much everyone is awash in data these days. And so when you have a lot of these skills, people are looking for things like data scientists who are able to take data, who are able to kind of find meaning within kind of this sea of numbers, and then do some knowledge translation and actually make it understandable to people who don't have that training and don't have those backgrounds. So that's a really important skill that you do pick up in one of our degrees. But in terms of actually like finding the jobs, yeah, you're just looking at a lot of the time you're looking at talking to advisors and talking to your supervisors and seeing kind of what connections do they have in the community. A lot of the time we have students going into nonprofits and going into different kind of political arenas, but also business. There's like tons of different places are looking for people with the skills that you would pick up in a psych degree, but you're not really kind of, I don't think there are very many websites that are like particular for us, just like these are just our jobs. But there's a lot of word of mouth, especially if you end up going into academia. A lot of the job postings, just kind of making sure you're like, hey, these are the institutions that I would like to teach at. They do have little kind of sub websites on those where they post their new job ads. And so kind of keeping track of those sites and kind of keeping them bookmarked and revisiting them every once in a while would be really helpful.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Robin, do you want to also share anything about the job search or just anything about careers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Matt already touched a lot on some really good points. And one thing I'll add, so my roommate who had gone through the psychology program before me, I mentioned that they had gotten into working with data science for business and market analytics. Part of the reason they got hired over someone with more statistical experience was because they had a psychology background. They had the data science background for working with large data sets, but because they had a psychology background, it made them more interesting to the company. And so even though, yeah, they've needed some additional training on how to work with these advanced models that they're, working with, the company has really appreciated the unique perspective that a psychology degree gave them in terms of research and development and coming up with new variables that might make it easier to find better locations for businesses to set up shops. So that, having the psychology background, even when you are switching to another field, you're not losing any of that learning that you got. In fact, it makes you stand out in so many ways. And likewise, I think I mentioned my friend who got her bachelor's in cognitive science or psychology, and all the skills that she used to study StarCraft 2 and eye tracking here in the lab, she's now using those exact same skills to study HIV. So, the skills were the same no matter what field you were in. Like Matt said, it's just the phenomena of interest changes. And then, yeah, another friend of mine who did her postdoc here, she's working at Google now doing quantitative user research on search analytics or YouTube trends. And translating that to the business decision makers. Because here's the real thing about having a stats background and a psychology background combined. Stats people are sometimes really terrible at explaining what the numbers actually mean. Someone with a psychology background, we tend to be a little bit more humanistic, and we can empathize with, people who don't have a stats background. And so your job then is to translate, okay, you've ran these advanced statistical models. Why do we care about them? What's the story of that data set? And that's, I think, where a psychology background really helps balance that quantitative with the human component.
Mhm. And I think that's what I love about psychology, because I also did a degree in psychology, and you can apply psychology to so many things because you're learning about people, right? And about humans, about interactions, right? So yes, thank you, Robin, for sharing that. We do have a little bit of time left for a few more questions. So if there's any questions that we can't get to, we will post probably a Q&A on our website, but I think we do have some time for a few more questions. I see there's a few questions about honors, so perhaps Sherene, if you want to take a stab at that, because I know you did your honors at SFU. First question, is it beneficial to have an honors program done, or is research experience being seen as equivalent? Another question is, will you recommend doing honors for clinical? So feel free to go ahead and take a stab at that.
Yeah, totally. Yes to both. So an honors degree is definitely beneficial, and that's not to say that if you finished your degree or you're about to graduate, you should add another year. There are other ways to get kind of equivalent experience, but it honestly would be kind of what's sometimes referred to as like a post-bac, which is like basically being an RA for a year after graduation. Another way would be those undergraduate student research awards I mentioned. So on those, you're usually working on an independent project, because that's really what they're looking for there is your ability to conceptualize a research question that's feasible, conduct the study and analyze the data, write up the results, all within a pretty specific time frame. So our honors program is quite strenuous. Like there's a lot of work that you do. I would recommend, mine went totally fine with designing it from the start, but I did start designing like way back in the spring. So the actual honors program is 8 months. It starts in September and then you would finish in April. Almost everyone says to do a directed studies or something in the summer before that September to kind of get your lit review done and stuff. So honors definitely beneficial. I think it's required for you should have at least that or an equivalent, like a year of independent research experience when you're applying to clinical, because what part of your master's is that you have to do your research as well. And it's all about kind of independently doing it. So there are other ways to get some kind of independent research experience through directed studies and just proposing projects and volunteering your time in that way. But I would recommend doing an honors though if you do have the option, and it's great for building relationships for grad school. So I did mine with Shannon, but I also did a directed studies with Marlene, my current supervisor, at the same time. So those independent research projects are really good for building those relationships, because that's how you get one-on-one time with supervisors.
Yes, thank you, Sherene. Matt, Robin, if there's anything else you can add to that, feel free to jump in. I know we're almost at time, so
No, just a small point is that I think a lot of students do assume that you require an honors to get into grad school, and that's often not the case. A lot of the time, it is very beneficial because you do have that experience and you can cite, hey, this is the research project that I did, and these are the people that I worked with. And our honors seminar course in particular is extremely helpful for kind of helping you, like walking you through, okay, this is how you contacted your potential supervisors, and it gives you a lot of practical skills. But you don't actually have to have an honors degree in order to apply to grad school or get into grad school. It's just one of those beneficial things that can really help your case. But please, if you have a really great record academically and you've been helping out with labs and doing all this practical experience and you want to apply, do. You still can get in even without having gotten the actual honors degree.
Yes, that's a really good point. On our website, we also say that we do recommend that you have a psych honors, but it's not required. So if you don't have an honors, you can also have a psych major, but with strong research experience. So either or, I think, will work when applying for our programs. I know we're at time now. It's 5:30. We actually received quite a few questions. We got about 40, but I think we got through about 8 to 10. So for any of the questions that we didn't get through, we can put together a quick Q&A on our website. You can also reach out to us afterwards for any questions, but I know we're at time. So I do want to take a moment just to thank all of our speakers today for sharing your journey with us. I learned a lot about each of you, and so thank you for taking the time to speak with us. I wish you all the best. I know finals are coming up, so don't forget to take some time for yourself, for some self-care. Also pass it over to Justine, who's my co-host today. She did a wonderful job. She helped organize this event as well as our SEI. So hand over to Justine.
Yes, just thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to our lovely speakers. And I hope that everyone was able to learn a bit more about grad school. And yeah, it's just been a pleasure hosting this event for you guys, and have a good night.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.